So before we begin today's video, I just wanted to preface it with a quick statement. If you liked this character, and if you like this movie, good for you. I'm happy for you. Please go and enjoy the things you enjoy and live in blissful contentment. Myself, I'm a bit more critical of the hobbies that I like, whether that's video games, music, movies, or comic books. I don't appreciate the insinuation that the only people who didn't like this movie or this character are sexists or misogynists, when that couldn't be further from the truth. Today I'd like to present the case against this character from a comic book reader's perspective. Please note that these are just my opinions and I don't speak for all comic book fans, obviously. But with that out of the way, I'd like to welcome you to Captain Marvel, A History of Mediocrity. So before we even begin to discuss the cringe fest that was this movie, we need to do some housekeeping. There are some things that need to be considered in order to explain and understand the disinterest and ire that comic book fans like myself have for this character. And in order to do that, we need to go back in time to 1968 with the creation of the original Captain Marvel, Mar-Vell. He was a Kree spy sent to Earth for espionage who eventually takes a liking to us meager Earthlings and becomes one of our defenders. The book debuts in 1968 to almost unanimous disinterest. This public sentiment for the character never truly abates, causing it to go through many revisions and reboots on a near-yearly basis. Jim Starlin's career was basically launched on the back of this character, but he was probably more known for Adam Warlock. And while he did have mild success writing and drawing the character through the 70s, it just never really took off. In fact, Marvel only bothered to keep the book semi-active, relegating it to a bi-monthly publication, just enough to ward off DC Comics' trademark of the Fawcett Comics character that they sniped the character from, which forced DC to run their Captain Marvel as Shazam, but let's not get into all that. What's important to note about the OG Captain Marvel, at least for this video, is that this trend of disinterest led to Marvel publishing its first ever graphic novel, The Death of Captain Marvel, in 1982, where, as the title implies, the original Captain Marvel is killed off. Why did they do this? Well, it's a combination of a lot of things. Public disinterest in the character was probably the primary reason, but most damning is that his stories just weren't all that interesting. Perhaps if Marvel actually cared more about the book, it might have gone somewhere really special, but history went in another direction. So let's rewind a bit to 1977. Marvel creates a spin-off series of Captain Marvel called Ms. Marvel. This is the reintroduction of Carol Danvers. She was a security chief in the Air Force, who was not exactly your run-of-the-mill set-piece damsel, but more or less functioned that way for the original narrative. She gets caught in this explosion of a Kree device. Mar-Vell shields her from most of the blast, however, their genetic structures merge for a moment, giving her comparable powers to his. The initial run of her comic builds some background for the character and establishes her as one of the first strong, independent women, and this was by design. She was intentionally used to court the women's liberation movement of the time. The trouble was that the vast majority of comic book readers of the time were young boys who had little to no interest in that sort of thing, so sales were naturally abysmal. Though the direction of the character seemed unfocused, she was, at least initially, poised to be a pseudo-sidekick to Captain Marvel, a sort of Sue Storm-Reed Richards team-up that takes place somewhere in the first 20 issues. Neat, you might say. But the fact remains that her books still didn't sell, so as a last-ditch effort, she was given a boost into the Avengers in 1980. Now, the film-going MCU fan probably doesn't realize this, but being a part of the Avengers didn't necessarily mean much back then. This is a bit of a tangent, but the Avengers books were never truly a high-selling comic. In fact, during the late 80s and 90s, they were only able to meet average sales at best, barring some special foil cover or event issue or the addition of a new team member. I mention this specifically so that you don't hear, "Hey, but Carol was on the Avengers," and think that that somehow was a mighty feat back in the day, emblematic of her popularity, when that couldn't be further from the truth. Many heroes were cycled in and out of the Avengers on a routine basis as a means of trying to kickstart new or flagging characters. Does anyone remember Stingray? Or Triathlon? Actually, that might make for a great video in current political climate, so I should write that one down. Regardless, it was a step up from the obscurity she was in prior to joining the team. Unfortunately, they bumped Scarlet Witch out of the roster in order to add her to the team, and I'm sure that annoyed the hell out of a lot of people back then too. We're not going to cover too many of the specifics of her adventures here. The important thing to note is that even when added to a mainstay household name like the Avengers, she still never catches on. After a very strange series of events in the early 80s involving abduction and forced insemination, it was decided she would be attacked by Rogue of the X-Men under the influence of Mystique, whom Miss Marvel had been feuding with at that point. During this encounter, all of Carol's powers and even memories are absorbed by Rogue, so Danvers is basically sidelined yet again at this point. Her memories are then later restored by Professor X. She breaks into the Pentagon and removes all mentions of her having been Miss Marvel. She then goes off on some wacky space adventure with the X-Men and is experimented on by an alien race called the Brood, which leads to her becoming the character known as Binary. Okay, but what happened with her memories being in Rogue's head? Well, as if Ms. Marvel wasn't dead enough, when Rogue passes through this supernatural device called the Siege Perilous, the persona of Miss Marvel, who up until that point had been a sometimes annoying personality in Rogue's head, is separated from her and made manifest, only to then be killed by Magneto in the same issue. So are you getting a sense for how much writers and fans cared about this character yet? So, into the 90s we go, and Carol Danvers is left to near total obscurity. She goes back to join the Avengers at one point with a reduction in power and a new alias called Warbird. Despite this somewhat interesting reintroduction, she's later revealed to be a raging alcoholic and is then kicked off the team. In fact, they hint at this alcoholism in the very first issue that she rejoins the Avengers, when Tony suspects she's hiding something when she lies to him about why she's checking out the hooch behind the Avengers' in-house bar. The 2000s see her come to more prominence, specifically her 2006 run, but even then only mildly so. And if I didn't already dislike her enough by now, she sides with Iron Man in wanting to pass the Superhuman Registration Act in Civil War, so boo this woman until the end of time. And then in the mid-2000s, she's reimagined yet again, but this time going back to her more vocally feminist no fun allowed roots. She goes back to having wacky space adventures as she did in her Binary days, and that brings us to today. The point of all of this background was to emphasize just how disinterested the public was with this character. And not even just the public. The writers constantly tried to find ways to either write her out of their stories or to outright kill her off. Carol Danvers just wasn't fun. She wasn't fun to read about, she wasn't fun to create for, and I think that might be the biggest sin you can commit as a comic book creator, is not making the character interesting. Sure, they gave her some interesting narratives here and there, but most of the time they revolved around other teams like the X-Men or the Avengers. She never truly stood out on her own. And so that brings us to 2018, and if you thought they used her to push cringe before, you weren't prepared for what was to come. In an attempt to establish itself as this mammoth of wokeness, Disney decides to utilize one of its least interesting characters in an attempt to extol the virtues of feminism. Captain Marvel, stunning and brave Superman wannabe with eternal RBF and a penchant for beating you up and stealing your personal belongings if you happen to annoy her. Truly the embodiment of heroism. Honestly, a full review of this film is kind of moot at this point, as anyone with a modicum of interest has already seen it, and have had plenty of time to partake in the roast buffet that was available here on the internet. But I will say a few things about it, and the first thing is that the first act was the most watchable. It is my only charitable conceit, however, for this pile of tepid paint-by-numbers drivel that I can give. The entire plot of this movie seems to exist solely to serve the idea that women are infallible demigods and damn any men who get in their way. The writers seem hell-bent on hurrying you towards Earth despite all of the cool shit taking place out in outer space, not that they would have explained any of that anyway, not to mention a heaping helping of 90s nostalgia. It's fitting that her story takes place in the 90s, actually. It's as if the writers at Marvel were just so damn mad that no one gave a crap about her back then, so they were gonna throw her back to the time of Bill Clinton and Blockbuster just to show them how wrong those unwashed plebeians were. Oh, and the central plot of the film is a man holding Danvers back, and now she's pissed and has to get revenge. Yeah. Annette Bening is cast as the original Captain Marvel, in yet another pandering sex swap moment. What was wrong with the original Marvel being a guy? Why did that need to change? Oh, right, because it's 2018 and her actual origins were probably too problematic, running counter to the feminist narrative that this film ceaselessly pushes into your eyeballs at every available opportunity. And the gags! Oh lord, the gags! If there is one single element that I can point to in this film and prove that it was written by the marketing department, it's the humor. Danvers fights an old lady! Hilarious! The cat's actually a space monster! Wacky! Oh, look at those Skrulls in hoodies. Aren't they just like us? Yeah, our differences are few and far between, guys. Danvers, you mad woman. So I hope this video helped to illustrate what the comic book fans' perspective was going into this movie. Carol Danvers was just never very popular. She went through reboot after reboot, redesign after redesign in an attempt to curry favor with fans to largely no success. Disney really had an opportunity here to do something special with the character, to make me care about Captain Marvel, which would have been a feat in and of itself. But instead, they opted for the laziest means of virtue signaling that they could have muster, and instead gave us this tepid, checkbox, paint-by-numbers film that largely will be forgotten about in 1 year's time. Oh, it's 2019, and most people have already forgotten about it. As I said earlier, they already have the Scarlet Witch, one of the most powerful characters in all of Marvel. Think about that movie. It could have been her and Vision going off on some cool adventure to unlock some latent ability of hers. I would have been totally on board for that. But no. Instead of that, we got Chuckles McFunhouse and the School of Feminism. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. It took a lot of time to make to really get all of the scans and everything right and all the graphics. It's a lot more editing than I've ever done, so hopefully you appreciate that. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm going to be doing a lot more content like this in the future. Please like the video as well. I know it sounds really cringy to beg for likes, but with this Sentinel-operated dystopian present that we live in, it's the only way for YouTube to get my videos out to people who otherwise wouldn't have seen it. But thanks for watching, guys. Thank you for your time. And I'll see you again next time.